The air in the living room at Graceland crackled with anticipation, thick with the scent of Priscilla's jasmine perfume and the faint aroma of fried peanut butter and banana sandwiches. Elvis, lounging on the plush white sofa, a new movie script resting unread on his chest, felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in months. His latest film, Paradise Blue, was finally out, after what felt like an eternity of shooting under the scorching California sun. He'd worked hard, sung all the songs the studio asked for, done all the silly antics they'd written. He was ready for the good reviews, the kind that filled newspaper pages with praise for the king, for his undeniable charisma, for the sheer joy he brought to millions. Red West, one of Elvis's closest friends and part of the Memphis Mafia, sauntered in, holding the morning paper. "All righty, let's see what the critics are saying about your latest masterpiece," he drawled, a playful grin on his face. Sonny West and Joe Esposito were already settled nearby, sipping their morning coffee, ready to hear the inevitable accolades. Elvis chuckled, running a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair. "Don't tell me, Red, they're calling me the greatest actor since Brando, right?" Red unfolded the paper, his smile still in place, but a slight hesitation entered his voice as he scanned the entertainment section. "Well, there's a big headline here, Elvis's Paradise Blues, a tropical travesty." "Oh, that's just one of them. Let me find a better one." Playful banter in the room died down, replaced by a sudden quiet. Elvis felt a prickle of unease. He watched Red's face, which slowly began to lose its lightheartedness. Red cleared his throat, his eyes fixed on a specific column. This one's by Rex Thorne. He's one of the big ones. E from the New York Times." Elvis sat up, the script falling to the floor. "Well, read it, Red." His voice was calm, but a tension began to coil in his stomach. Red swallowed his gaze, flicking up to Elvis, then back to the paper. The last words hung in the air like poison. The room was utterly silent. Joe and Sonny exchanged worried glances. Red's face was pale. Elvis felt a cold wave wash over him, followed by a burning heat that flushed his face. Sleepwalking, predictable fluff, forgettable songs. This wasn't just a bad review. It was a personal attack, a declaration that he was a faded, uninspired artist. His jaw tightened. He snatched the paper from Red's hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He scanned the words himself, his eyes darting across the damning paragraphs. Each word felt like a punch to the gut, no genuine effort that cut deepest. He remembered the long days, the heat, the endless takes, the pressure to just get it done. He had put in effort, hadn't he? Or had he just put in what was expected? This is ridiculous," Elvis muttered, his voice low and tight. "He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't know what goes into these pictures." Joe Esposito stepped forward, trying to soothe the escalating tension. "It's just one critic, E. There'll be others who love it. You know how these guys are, always looking for something negative to say." But Elvis wasn't listening. He reread the part about his raw, electrifying talent being buried. A bitter laugh escaped him. Had he really lost that? Was he truly just a product, a pretty face on a studio conveyor belt? The idea was repulsive, terrifying. He stood up abruptly, crumpling the newspaper in his hand. "I'm going to my room." His voice was flat, devoid of its usual playful lilt. He walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The crumpled paper, a testament to the blow he had just received. King of rock and roll, hit where it hurt most. His art, his passion, his very soul. The door to his bedroom clicked shut, and the world outside faded into a blurry, indistinct hum. Elvis walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring out at the manicured lawns of Graceland, a familiar landscape that suddenly felt foreign, almost suffocating. The Memphis sun, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to mock him, its bright rays highlighting the darkness that had settled in his heart. He felt a confusing mix of anger and hurt swirling together like a storm. How dare Rex Thorne, some self-important wordsmith, dissect his work, his life, and dismiss it with such cold, clinical disdain, sleepwalking. The word echoed in his mind, stinging more than any other. He had put in the time, he had learned the lines, he had sung the psalms, he had done his job. Was that not enough? Was he supposed to bleed for every movie role, every sugary tune? Elvis kicked off his shoes, pacing the luxurious carpet, each step heavy with frustration. He thought about the endless grind of making those movies, the early mornings, the late nights, the reshoots, the constant pressure from Colonel Parker to just get it done and move on to the next. He remembered the songs all written by others, often sounding the same, never quite stirring his soul the way a raw blues tune or a gospel hymn could. He'd gone along with it because that's what he was supposed to do, what everyone expected. He was Elvis, the movie star. He walked over to his grand piano, his fingers hovering over the ivory keys. Usually, the piano was a sanctuary, a place where he could lose himself in music, explore melodies, feel the spiritual connection. But today, it felt inert. Silent even bring himself, he slumped onto the piano bench, leaning his elbows on the keys, pressing down a discordant chord. Was he truly a machine now, churning out predictable fluff? He closed his eyes, trying to recall the feeling of being on stage, just him and a guitar, pouring his heart out. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Yeah, just give me a minute, honey. He didn't want her to see him like this, so vulnerable, so raw. He was the king. He was supposed to be strong, unshakable. He heard her gentle sigh outside the door, then her footsteps fading away. He knew she meant well, but he couldn't talk about it right now. The wound was too fresh, too deep. He thought about the studio executives, Colonel Parker, all the people who praised him to his face, telling him how great he was, how the fans loved everything he did. Were they just lying, or were they just as blind as he was? The thought twisted in his gut. He got up and went to his record collection, scanning the spines. All the albums, his name emblazoned on every one. Millions sold, millions of screaming fans. How could one man, one critic, tear all that down with a few harsh paragraphs? It felt unfair, cruel, but somewhere a tiny uncomfortable voice whispered, "What if he's right?" He sank onto his bed, pulling the covers over himself. Even though the room was warm, he just wanted to disappear, to hide from the stinging words, from the uncomfortable truth they might hold. He just wanted to be Elvis, the boy from Tupelo, who loved music. Not Elvis, the predictable movie star, the prince of predictable fluff. The day ended in a haze of self-doubt and wounded pride, a king dethroned in his own mind. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting shadows across the Graceland grounds. Elvis remained cloistered in his rooms, or in the privacy of the TV room, a silent, brooding presence. The Memphis Mafia tiptoed around him, their usual boisterous jokes replaced by hushed whispers. Priscilla tried gently to coax him out, to talk, to eat, but he'd shrug her off or offer a curt reply, his eyes distant. Colonel Parker called, his booming voice crackling through the phone line. "Son, don't you worry about that highfalutin critic. He's just trying to make a name for himself. They always do this. Paradise Blues is a hit at the box office, that's what matters. Reviews are like indigestion. Son, they pass." Elvis listened half-heartedly. He knew the colonel meant well. In his own way. The colonel always focused on the numbers, the contracts, the tours. Artistry wasn't really in his vocabulary, not beyond its ability to generate revenue, but the money, the box office success. It didn't ease the ache in Elvis's soul. It was a hollow victory if the work itself felt empty. He found himself wandering through the halls of Graceland aimlessly. He passed the gold records gleaming on the walls, a testament to past glories. He saw photos of himself, young and vibrant, full of fire, captivating audiences, with just a flick of his wrist and a snarl of his lip. Where had that fire gone? Was it truly buried as the critic claimed? He drifted into a seldom-used den, a smaller, cozier room filled with old boxes. He hadn't been in here in years. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slicing through the curtains. He knelt down, curious, and pulled out a faded cardboard box. Inside were stacks of old fan mail tied with string, not the recent studio-screened letters, but ones from years ago, from the early days when fans felt like personal friends. He untied one bundle. The paper brittle. "My mom brought me your record, Heartbreak Hotel, and when I listen to it, I forget about the pain. For a little while, your singing makes me feel strong. My mom says, you're the king, and I believe her. Thank you for making my heart feel better. Please keep singing." Elvis felt a lump form in his throat. They were why he did it. Not for the critics, not for the money, but for the Billies of the world. He reached for another, a small crinkled envelope. "Dear Elvis, my husband works 2 jobs, and we don't have much, but when we put your records on, our whole family dances and sings. You bring such joy into our little house. Sometimes it feels like you're singing just for us. Thank you for the happiness you give us." This wasn't about fiction, about emotion, about giving people something real, something that touched their hearts. He remembered the feeling of singing in small clubs, sweat dripping down his face, eyes locked with every person in the room. He remembered the gospel sessions, the raw purity of the music, the way it lifted his spirit and the spirits of those around him. He looked at a faded photograph tucked into another bundle, a picture of him on stage, arms outstretched, microphone in hand, a sea of faces looking up at him, pure adoration in their eyes. He remembered the surge of energy, the overwhelming love, the responsibility he felt to give them his absolute best. The critic's words resurfaced, without an ounce of genuine effort. Was it true? Had he allowed the machine to take over? Had he forgotten Billy and the dancing family and the raw, hungry boy from Tupelo who just wanted to sing? Slow dawning realization began to bloom in the darkness of his mind. Critic might have been harsh, but perhaps he wasn't entirely wrong. Maybe, just maybe, Elvis had been so caught up in a celebrity, the demands, the comfort, that he had lost touch with the very core of why he started. He hadn't just been sleepwalking, he'd been forgetting. A spark, faint but undeniable. Ictophory. The fan letters, these genuine, heartfelt voices, were a reminder of what truly mattered. And he knew with a sudden clarity that if he was going to honor those voices, he needed to listen to the difficult ones too. The restless energy had not fully subsided, but it had shifted. Days later, still feeling a profound need for something beyond the familiar confines of Graceland, Elvis decided he needed to step out, to be just another face in the crowd. He'd done it before, when the pressure became too much, when he needed a dose of anonymous normalcy. Pulled on a simple denim jacket, a pair of dark sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He even tugged on a dark wig, making his famous hair disappear. He slipped out a side door, unheard by the usual bustle of the Memphis Mafia, and drove off in a nondescript sedan, leaving his flashy Cadillacs in the garage. He drove aimlessly for a while, letting the familiar streets of Memphis guide him. He passed by old haunts, places he'd frequented before fame had swallowed his anonymity. Eventually, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of a small, unpretentious diner on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place that served honest, hearty food and had regulars who knew each other by name. He slid into a booth near the back, ordering a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie. The waitress, a kind-faced woman who looked tired but friendly, didn't seem to recognize him, which was exactly what he wanted. He stirred his coffee, listening to the murmur of conversations around him. At a booth not far from his, an older man with kind eyes and a worn denim shirt was sitting with a boy who looked to be about 10 or 11. They were sharing a plate of fries and talking, their voices low but audible. "Grandpa, can we listen to Hound Dog again when we get home?" the boy asked, his eyes wide. "I like the way he sings it. It's so wild," the old man chuckled. That's Elvis for you. Son, nobody like him. Elvis felt a small, familiar warmth spread through him. Wild. That was a word he hadn't heard associated with his music. In a long time, the boy took a sip of his soda. Yeah, but the new movies, Grandpa, they're kinda lame all the same. He just sings, then fights, then sings again. The stories are boring. Elvis felt a jolt. The boy's innocent, unfiltered words hit him harder than any critic's scathing prose. Lame, boring, all the same. He felt a pang of disappointment, but also a strange sense of validation. It wasn't just Rex Thorne. Regular people, even kids who loved his music, felt it too. The old man sighed. Well, I know what you mean. Son, I miss the raw energy, the way he used to just grab you by the collar and shake you. He's still a legend. Mind you, still the king, but something that really showed what he could do. Elvis listened, his pie forgotten. He saw the genuine affection in the old man's eyes, even as he expressed his disappointment. It wasn't malice or intellectual snobbery. It was a heartfelt wish from someone who cared, someone who had been there from the beginning. It was a fan, a true fan who wanted more for him, not from him. He realized then that the critic Rex Thorne might be seeing a similar truth, just expressing it in a more academic, less forgiving way. He wasn't trying to tear Elvis down out of spite, but perhaps out of a belief that Elvis was capable of so much more than he was currently showing. As the old man reached for his wallet, Elvis noticed he fumbled with a few crumpled bills. Counting them slowly, his face held a hint of worry as he looked at the check. It was clear he was struggling. Without thinking, Elvis reached into his own wallet. He slipped a crisp $20 bill onto the counter, gesturing discreetly to the waitress as she walked by. He pointed to the old man and boy's table, giving her a silent nod. "Their bill, ma'am, and keep the change." The waitress's eyes widened slightly in surprise, but she simply nodded, picked up the bill and walked towards the counter. Elvis finished his coffee, a sense of quiet purpose settling over him. He stood up, leaving the diner before the waitress could deliver the news to the old man, before anyone could thank him or worse, recognize him. He didn't want thanks, he just wanted to do something, anything that felt real. As he walked out into the afternoon sun, the disguise felt less like a shield and more like a tool. He had heard the truth, not from the grand pronouncements of a critic, but from the simple, honest words of a boy and his grandfather, and in that moment he knew what he had to do. He had to face that truth, not hide from it, and maybe, just maybe, rediscover the wild, genuine spirit that had made him the king in the first place. Back at Graceland, the familiar grandeur of his home offered a different kind of solace than it had days before. The anger and resentment that had clouded his mind had begun to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, almost serene sense of introspection. The words of the boy in the diner, the honest disappointment in the old man's voice echoed in his mind, providing a clearer mirror than any review ever could. He spent the evening in his private screening room, a space usually reserved for watching his favorite B-movies or westerns. Tonight, though, he put on Paradise Blues. He'd watched it countless times during the production process, then again at the premiere, all through a haze of expectation and self-congratulation. But tonight, he watched it with the critic's words and the voices of the ordinary people in his head. He sat alone in the dark, the film flickering on the large screen. He saw himself, young and handsome, flashing his trademark smile, singing the catchy, forgettable tunes, and as he watched, a painful truth began to emerge. Rex Thorne hadn't been entirely wrong. The plot was flimsy. The songs, while pleasant enough, lacked the passion, the raw, bluesy soul, the gospel fervor that had once defined his music. He saw the scenes where he had rushed through the lines, where his smile didn't quite reach his eyes, where he was merely going through the motions. He remembered the feeling on set, the exhaustion, the desire to just get it over with and move on. He had been so focused on fulfilling the contract, on pleasing the studio, on maintaining the image of the box office king, that he had lost sight of the art itself. He saw the moments where he, the genuine Elvis Presley, was truly absent. He was a character, a caricature even, of himself. The sleepwalking accusation which had so enraged him now felt painfully accurate. A heavy sigh escaped him. It hurt truly deeply to admit it. Confront the fact that he, Elvis Presley, had allowed himself to become complacent, to take his incredible talent for granted. He remembered the fierce ambition of his youth, the hunger to prove himself, the relentless drive to make every performance, every song unforgettable. That hunger, that fire had been dulled by comfort and routine. He paused the film, the frozen image of his smiling face staring back at him. He stood up, walked to his guitar collection, and picked up his favorite acoustic, a well-worn instrument that had been with him through countless late-night jam sessions. He sat down, not on a fancy chair, but cross-legged on the floor, the way he used to do when he was just starting out. He didn't play a movie song. He started with an old gospel hymn, Peace in the Valley, the notes resonating deep within him, filling the room with a spiritual warmth. Then he moved to a raw blues, riff fingers dancing over the fretboard, finding the familiar, soulful chords that spoke of struggle and longing. He sang, not for an audience, not for a camera, but for himself, for the lost part of his soul. He felt the music in his bones, the way he used to. It wasn't about hitting the right note perfectly. It was about pouring out his heart, feeling every emotion in the lyrics, in the melody. When he finished, his voice hoarse, a strange sense of calm settled over him. It was a humility he hadn't known before, a willingness to see his own flaws, not as failures, but as opportunities for growth. The critic's words had been a painful mirror, but the reflection, though harsh, had shown him something important. He could be better. He needed to be better, not just for his fans, but for himself. He picked up a notepad and a pen. He began to write, not lyrics, but thoughts about creativity, authenticity, passion, about the difference between making a living and making art, about the responsibility of his gift. He wrote until the early hours of the morning, the ideas flowing freely, a new path starting to emerge from the darkness. The reflection was complete, and the path forward was clear. It started with humility, and it led towards truth. The morning after his long night of reflection, Elvis felt a strange blend of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had slept little, but his mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. The anger had finally receded, leaving behind a focused determination. He knew what he had to do, and it was going to be unconventional, perhaps even risky. He called Joe Esposito and Charlie Hodge, two of his most trusted friends, to his office. They walked in looking a little apprehensive, probably expecting another day of Elvis's brooding. Elvis sat behind his large desk, a rare sight, usually preferring to conduct business from a sofa. He looked at them, his eyes serious but calm. "Boys, I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few days," he began, his voice surprisingly steady, "about Paradise Blues, about Rex Thorne's review, about everything." Joe cleared his throat. "You gotta shake it off. That guy's a pompous windbag. The fans still love you. That's all that matters." Elvis held up a hand. "No, Joe, listen. He wasn't entirely wrong." Both men looked stunned. Charlie frowned. "He did," Elvis acknowledged, "and it stung. It stung worse than anything in a long time, but after sitting with it, after watching the movie again with new eyes, I saw his point. I had been coasting. I've been letting the machine run me, instead of the other way around. I haven't been giving my absolute best, not like I used to." Charlie asked cautiously. Elvis leaned forward, a spark in his eyes. "I'm going to do something about it, not by arguing, not by ignoring it. I want to face it. I want to understand it better, and I want to make sure I never fall into that trap again." He took a deep breath. Joe and Charlie stared at him as if he'd just announced he was going to fly to the moon. "Meet him?" Joe finally managed, his voice incredulous. "Why, to tell him off, to set him straight." "No," Elvis said, shaking his head. "To listen, to hear his perspective, face to face, to understand what he sees, what he wants from me, from my art, Not to argue, not to defend, but to understand. Charlie looked worried. This could backfire. He could write another article, say you're weak that you caved, the colonel will have a fit. I know, Elvis admitted, his gaze firm. But I don't care. This isn't about the colonel, or the public's perception. Right now, this is about my growth. If I can't humble my criticism, if I can't humble my sees things differently, then how can I ever grow? How can I ever get back to being the artist I know I can be? He stood up, walking to the window, looking out at the vastness of his estate. It's to ensure I can truly give them my best, authentically, from now on. His conviction was clear, unwavering. Joe and Charlie knew arguing was futile. Elvis had made up his mind. This was a new side of the king, a humble, brave side they hadn't often seen, and as risky as it felt, they knew they had to support him. The phone call from Colonel Tom Parker to Rex Thorne's office in New York had been complicated. Colonel, usually a master of manipulation, had been surprisingly blunt. Mr. Thorne, he'd boomed down the line. Elvis Presley wants to meet you. Not for an interview, not for a fight. He just wants to talk. Thorne had been utterly floored. He'd expected angry phone calls, perhaps even a lawsuit threat from the notoriously protective colonel. But this personal meeting request from the king himself, after one of the most scathing reviews of his career, it was unprecedented. Thorne, a man who prided himself on his intellectual detachment, felt a genuine ripple of intrigue and, if he was honest, a touch of apprehension. He agreed, though, with a healthy dose of skepticism. The meeting was arranged for a nondescript, neutral office suite in a quiet building in Beverly Hills, far from the bustling studios and the prying eyes of the press. Elvis flew in a day early, staying at a private residence, avoiding the usual fanfare. On the day of the meeting, Elvis wore a simple dark suit, no flashy accessories, no sequined jumpsuits. His hair was impeccably styled, but his demeanor was subdued, thoughtful. He arrived with only Joe Esposito, a silent, watchful presence. Rex Thorne was already there, pacing the small waiting area. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably dressed, with intelligent, piercing eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He held himself with a certain academic stiffness, a sharp contrast to Elvis's more fluidmatic presence. He looked nervous, though he tried to hide it. He probably expected a dressed-down, polite version of the Memphis Mafia to intimidate him, not the king himself. When Elvis walked in, Thorne stopped pacing mid-stride. Their eyes met across the quiet room. Thorne seemed to brace himself, his jaw tightening, perhaps anticipating a lecture, an outburst, or even a veiled threat. But Elvis simply walked forward, a slight, genuine smile on his face. He extended his hand. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice calm, warm, and surprisingly soft, "it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Thank you for taking the time." Thorne hesitated for a fraction of a second, then took Elvis's hand. His grip was firm, but his expression was one of profound surprise. He had expected anger, perhaps condescension, but not this polite, almost humble greeting. "Mr. Presley," he managed, his voice slightly formal, "the pleasure is unexpected." Elvis chuckled, a low, genuine sound. "I imagine it is. Please have a seat." He gestured to two armchairs arranged around a low coffee table. He sat down, not in a power position, but relaxed, open. Joe Esposito quietly took a seat in a corner of the room. Observing Thorne sat opposite him, adjusting his glasses. Tension in the room was palpable. A silent hum of two vastly different worlds colliding. Thorne's mind was racing, trying to anticipate Elvis's game plan. Was this a charm offensive? A calculated PR move? Elvis broke the silence, his voice gentle. "I won't pretend your review didn't hit me hard, Mr. Thorne. It did, it really did. But after the initial shock wore off, I found myself reflecting, and I came to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was some truth in what you wrote." Thorne's eyes widened slightly. This was not the confrontation he had prepared for. He had expected a defense, a deflection, not this startling admission. He leaned forward, intrigued, the journalist in him taking over. The king. The icon was showing a side of himself the world had never seen, and the conversation was just beginning. Elvis's words hung in the air, a stunning admission that completely disarmed Rex Thorne. Critic, usually so confident and articulate, found himself momentarily speechless. He had prepared for a defiant superstar, a charming PR maneuver, or even a furious tirade. He had not prepared for genuine humility. "Mr. Presley," Thorne began, finding his voice, I appreciate your honesty. My intention was never to be cruel, but to offer an honest assessment. From an artistic perspective, I understand that now, when I first read it, all I felt was anger and hurt, but then I start listening to what you were actually saying beyond the sharp edges. You talked about the raw, and I started to see it myself. He paused, meeting Thorne's gaze directly. I've been in this business a long time. Mr. Thorne, there are a lot of pressures, a lot of expectations. Sometimes you just go through the motions, trying to please everyone, and you lose sight of what truly matters. The art itself, the connection. He saw not the manufactured persona, but a man wrestling with his own artistic integrity. Precisely, Thorne said, leaning forward. Mr. Presley, I believe you are one of the most significant cultural forces of our time. Your early work, particularly your music, was revolutionary. It ignited a generate. But as a critic, it's been a long time since I felt truly stretched, truly excited about a role or a song in one of those pictures. Thorne was visibly impressed. It takes a remarkable level of self-awareness to admit that. Especially for someone in your position, most artists, when faced with criticism, either dismiss it or lash out. Well, I did my share of lashing out at first, Elvis admitted with a wry smile. But then I thought about all those kids who write to me telling me how my music helps them, how it brings joy. And I thought about the old-timers who've been with me since the beginning. They deserve the best of me, not just a watered-down version. He looked directly at Thorne again. So I want to ask you something, Mr. Thorne. As someone who clearly cares about art, about authenticity, what do you think? What should I do? How do I get that fire back? How do I make sure I'm giving my absolute best? Not just going through the motions? Thorne blinked, taken aback by the directness of the question. He hadn't expected to be asked for advice by Elvis Presley. He thought for a moment, then spoke thoughtfully. Show us the Elvis who is hungry, who is searching, who is growing. Don't be afraid to fail, but be afraid of becoming predictable. Elvis listened intently, nodding slowly. The words resonated deeply within him. It was a mirror of his own thoughts during his night of reflection. Conversation continued for another hour, not about Paradise Blues anymore, but about music, about acting, about the nature of fame and authenticity. Thorne found himself speaking with an artist, not just a celebrity. Elvis found himself speaking with someone who saw him as more than a product. When the meeting finally concluded, there were no grand pronouncements, no promises of future collaborations. But as Elvis stood to shake Thorne's hand again, there was a new understanding in his eyes, a quiet respect. Thank you, Mr. Thorne, Elvis said, his voice sincere. You've given me a lot to think about, more than you know. Thorne looked at the legendary figure before him, no longer just the subject for a review, but a man. Mr. Presley, he replied, a genuine smile forming on his face. The pleasure truly was all mine. The meeting ended, leaving both men changed by the unexpected encounter. Critic had met a humble king, and the king had found an unlikely guide to his own artistic rebirth. News of the unprecedented meeting between Elvis Presley and Rex Thorne didn't leak immediately. Colonel Parker, although initially furious, had understood the need for discretion after witnessing Elvis's unshakable resolve. He held the story tight, knowing that if handled correctly, it could be a powerful moment. A few days later, a new column by Rex Thorne appeared in the New York Times. The headline wasn't a review, but a simple, intriguing title. A Conversation with the King. Thorne didn't retract his original review of Paradise Blues. he stood by his critical assessment of the film itself. But the article that followed was unlike anything he had ever written, or anything the public had ever read, about Elvis Presley. He began by describing his initial shock at the meeting request, his skepticism. Then he detailed the conversation itself, carefully omitting private specifics but conveying the essence of their exchange. He painted a picture of an Elvis who was humble, reflective, and deeply committed to his craft, despite the pressures of his colossal fame. He described Elvis's willingness to listen, to admit vulnerability, to ask for honest perspective. Thorne quoted Elvis directly, "Growth sometimes means admitting you might have gotten lost for a bit." He highlighted Elvis's genuine desire to rediscover the passion and authenticity that had defined his early career. He wrote about the profound personal struggle beneath the glittering surface of superstardom, a struggle to remain true to oneself amidst overwhelming commercial demands. The article was a bombshell. It wasn't praise, but it was far from a pan. It was an acknowledgement of Elvis's humanity, his artistic conscience, and his surprising capacity for humility. The reaction was immediate and varied. Fans who had been fiercely defending the king against Thorne's initial review were now confronted with a new narrative. Some were confused, unable to reconcile the image of their invincible idol with an Elvis who admitted fault. Others, however, were deeply moved. Letters poured into newspapers and fan clubs, expressing admiration for Elvis's courage and vulnerability. He was no longer just an untouchable icon. He was a human being, striving and growing, just like them. The music industry was stunned. Critics, who often saw artists as entitled and unreceptive, praised Thorne for his unique approach and Elvis for his unprecedented humility. Spark conversations about the relationship between artist and critic, about authenticity and entertainment. Colonel Parker, ever the opportunist, watched the public reaction unfold. He had been worried, but the tide was overwhelmingly positive. This vulnerability, this humility had humanized Elvis in a way that no carefully staged publicity stunt ever could. It made him more relatable, more endearing. It added a new layer to his legendary persona. A week later, Elvis himself issued a brief public statement. It wasn't a direct response to Thorne's article, but a message to his fans broadcast on a national radio show. "Sometimes that means taking a hard look at myself, at my work, and being honest about where I can improve. It's a journey, and I'm grateful to have you all along for the ride. I promise to always give you my heart, and to keep growing for all of us." The statement was short, humble, and perfectly timed. It didn't mention the critic or the specific movie, but it affirmed the core message of Thorne's article. Elvis was listening, he was reflecting, and he was dedicated to growth. The world had seen a glimpse behind the curtain of superstardom, and what they found was not arrogance, but a surprisingly humble king. Months turned into a year, and the subtle shifts in Elvis Presley's career began to ripple outwards, becoming more apparent with each passing project. The meeting with Rex Thorne, the quiet reflection, and the subsequent public response had, in a profound way, reshaped the king's path. His next film project was chosen with far more deliberation. Gone were the immediate formulaic choices. Elvis himself insisted on reading scripts more thoroughly, looking for a story that offered a little more depth, a character that wasn't just a carbon copy of his previous roles. He pushed for songs that had more emotional weight, that allowed him to truly sing, not just croon. While the studio still had its demands, Elvis, now armed with a renewed sense of purpose and self-awareness, exerted more influence. He wasn't difficult. He was just demanding of himself and his art. In the recording studio, the change was even more palpable. Elvis spent hours, sometimes late into the night, exploring new sounds, revisiting old blues and gospel numbers that had first ignited his passion. He experimented with different vocal approaches, pushing his range, finding nuances he hadn't touched in years. There was a raw energy in his voice that hadn't been heard since his Sun Records days, but now fused with the maturity and control of a seasoned artist. The songs felt lived and authentic, each note carrying a piece of his renewed soul. He worked more closely with musicians, fostering a collaborative spirit, seeking out their input, listening intently. His stage performances, too, gained a new depth. He wasn't just hitting the marks, delivering the signature moves. There was a renewed intensity in his eyes, a deeper connection with the audience. He lingered on notes, letting the emotions swell, making each song feel like a personal conversation with every person in the room. He still had the charisma, the moves, the famous smile, but now it was underpinned by a rediscovered passion, a genuine joy in performing that resonated deeply with his fans. They felt it, sensed the difference, and responded with even greater adoration. Elvis continued to surround himself with his trusted circle, the Memphis Mafia, but he also sought out different voices. He engaged in longer, more thoughtful conversations with musicians, songwriters, and even intellectuals. He was still the generous, fun-loving Elvis, but beneath it was a man who understood the value of continuous learning, of remaining open to new ideas and perspectives. He never sought out Rex Thorne again for another meeting, nor did Thorne write another column directly about Elvis, but a quiet, unspoken understanding had formed between them, a mutual respect born from that one surprising encounter. Thorne continued to review films and music, but his writing about Elvis in subsequent projects, while still critical when necessary, of appreciation for the artist's continued journey and dedication. As time went on, Elvis often reflected on that period. The dark days after the crushing review, he had realized that true strength wasn't about always being praised or proving others wrong with defiance. It was about facing uncomfortable truths, about the courage to admit when you've lost your way, and the humility to learn from it. That critical review, initially a devastating blow, had ultimately become a catalyst, guiding him back to the very heart of his artistic purpose. He hadn't stopped being the king, the global icon, but he had become a more grounded, more human king. And in that he found not just greater success, but a deeper, more profound sense of fulfillment, both as an artist and as a man. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the hardest truths can bring the greatest growth, and true strength often lies in the surprising power of humility.